My name is Gerald Whitmore, and 4 years ago, my wife of 22 years walked out of our home in the Hunter Valley and took nearly everything with her. The vineyard we'd built together across 14 acres of red soil. The cellar door business that had taken a decade to become profitable. Even Biscuit, our golden retriever, who'd slept at the foot of our bed since he was 8 weeks old. The settlement papers landed on my birthday. I turned 62 reading documents that told me I was worth less than nothing. She didn't even send a message, just had her solicitor email them through at 7:30 in the morning while I was still in my dressing gown making tea. "You'll fade away out here on your own," her sister had told me at the mediation. "You were always more comfortable talking to your vines than to people. Maybe that's your problem." At 62 years old, I went from owning a functioning winery with 14 full-time staff to driving my 2009 Holden Ute between farms in the Upper Hunter, doing contract fencing work for properties that used to buy my Shiraz. From waking up to the sound of magpies over my own land to sleeping in a single room above a hardware store in Muswell Brook, where the floorboards creaked every time the bloke next door rolled over. From having my children visit on weekends to watching their names appear on my phone screen less and less, until eventually the calls stopped altogether. But here is what nobody tells you about losing everything after 60. It strips away every story you've been telling yourself about who you are. And sometimes, when all those stories are gone, what's underneath is something you never expected to find. On a Tuesday in March, a woman left a canvas shopping bag in the back of my ute. I'd been doing a favor for a neighbor, dropping her into Singleton for a medical appointment. She was in her 80s, moved slowly, and had 3 bags to manage. When I got home that evening and opened the tray, there it was, a green bag with a Woolworths logo, heavy with what turned out to be medication, a wallet, and a manila folder marked Property Confidential. I could have left it. Could have called the neighbor in the morning and arranged something. But my mother always said that the character of a person is measured by what they do when there's no one watching and no reward on offer. So I drove the 40 minutes back to Singleton, knocked on the door of the address I had, and handed the bag to the woman's daughter, who opened the door in her kitchen apron with flour on her wrists. She looked at my face the way you look at someone you've seen in a photograph. Her expression shifted, not shock exactly, more like something clicking into place after a long time. She said, "You're not from around here originally, are you? What's your family name?" "Whitmore," I told her. "Gerald Whitmore." She went very still. Then she said, quietly, "Is your mother's maiden name Calloway? From Armadale?" I felt the ground shift under me slightly, the way it does when a vehicle hits loose gravel at speed. "That's right," I said. "How would you know that?" She stepped back from the doorway and said, "You need to come inside." My mother, Patricia Calloway, had grown up in Armadale, in the New England tablelands of New South Wales. She was the youngest of 4 children, the only girl, and by every account, she'd had a harder life than she deserved. Her father was a difficult man who drank. Her brothers left as soon as they were old enough, and she'd married my father, a fencing contractor named Alan Whitmore, when she was 19. She never spoke much about her life before Alan. I used to assume it was because there wasn't much worth saying. My mother had died 11 years earlier, in 2015. My father had gone 2 years before her. I was an only child. What family I had left existed mostly in Christmas cards and occasional phone calls from a cousin in Brisbane I hadn't seen since 1998. I built our vineyard, Whitmore Estate, from a property that had been running beef cattle since the 1960s. My wife, Diane, and I had purchased it in 1994 when the land was cheap, and the idea of boutique wineries in the Hunter Valley was only just beginning to make sense. I was 32. We had 2 children, our son, Marcus, who was 6, and our daughter, Ellie, who was 3. The first 5 years were genuinely hard. I worked the fencing contracts during the day and planted vines on weekends. Diane managed the books and looked after the children. We ate cheap and reinvested everything. By the time the first Shiraz was ready for commercial release, Marcus was in high school and Ellie was learning to drive. The wine critic from the Newcastle Herald described our 2003 vintage as one of the most promising debuts from a Hunter Valley producer in a decade. Diane framed the review and hung it in the cellar door. Those were the years I felt most alive. The land knew me by then. I knew which corner of the north paddock drained too slowly after rain, which row of Semillon got the afternoon shade that made the fruit more delicate, which part of the driveway flooded if the creek came up. I knew the property the way you know your own body, the aches and the strengths both. Diane's brother, Craig, arrived in 2019. He was a financial consultant from Sydney. All pressed shirts and opinions. He started coming up at weekends, walking the property with a measuring expression, asking questions about our debt structure and asset valuation. Diane began using words like leverage and liquidity over dinner. She said I was too attached to the physical side of the operation, that I wasn't thinking about the vineyard as a financial asset. I should have paid more attention to what was happening. Craig connected Diane with a buyer, a corporate hospitality group from Melbourne that was acquiring boutique wineries across the region to bundle into a portfolio. He'd been advising them. I found out later that he'd been in conversations with them for nearly 8 months before Diane mentioned it to me, presented as a reasonable option we should at least consider. I refused to sell. The vineyard was not a portfolio asset. It was my life's work. I knew every vine on that property. The separation was filed 4 months later. Craig managed Diane's financial disclosure during the proceedings. The property valuation came in at a number I didn't recognize, inflated, assessed at peak tourism revenue figures that bore no relationship to a realistic operational picture. My solicitor was competent but not aggressive. The mediator seemed to find my attachment to the land unreasonable. I was awarded a cash settlement of $340,000 and no claim on the property. Diane received the vineyard, the equipment, the cellar door business, and the goodwill. Craig's hospitality group completed the purchase 8 weeks after the settlement was finalized. Standing in the car park outside the mediation center in Cessnock, I did the arithmetic. 14 years of profitable operation. A property worth, by honest reckoning, somewhere between $2.8 and $3.4 million. A business with an annual turnover that had hit $680,000 in our best year. And I walked away with enough to buy a modest house in a regional town if I was careful, which was no longer in my name. My solicitor put his hand on my shoulder and said the system wasn't built for people who loved what they'd made. I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't say anything. Contract fencing work was what I knew from my father, so it was what I went back to. I had the ute, I had the tools, and I had the physical fitness that comes from a life spent outdoors. At 62, I could still sink a post, as well as men 20 years younger. And in the upper Hunter, there was always someone who needed a fence. I wasn't proud in the way that would have stopped me working. I was proud in the way that made me do the job properly. I developed a routine because routine was the only thing that kept the silence from becoming oppressive. Up at 5. 2 slices of toast with Vegemite, strong tea, the ABC radio news. Load the tools. Drive to whatever property had work. Come home when the light went. Cook something simple. Sleep. Do it again. Sundays I tried to call Marcus or Ellie. Marcus had sided entirely with his mother, which I told myself I understood because he'd always been closer to her. Ellie was more measured, but she was living in Melbourne with her partner, and her life had its own full weight. The calls were polite and unsatisfying. The kind where both people are slightly relieved when it's over. I didn't let myself feel the full weight of it during working hours. You can't, when the work requires attention. A fence post, in the wrong position, is a fence post that has to come out and go back in. The land doesn't care about your grief. That's actually one of the things I've always respected about it. The woman who invited me inside that March evening was named Karen Hollis. Her mother, Eileen, was the woman I'd driven to Singleton. Karen made tea and sat me down at a kitchen table covered in the organized clutter of a busy family homeschool notices, a jar of pasta, someone's sport shoes. She was in her mid-50s. Practical and direct. The sort of person who gets to the point because she respects you enough not to waste your time. She told me that her mother, Eileen, had known my mother, Patricia, from Armadale. They had grown up on neighboring streets. They'd been close friends as girls before Patricia had left for Tamworth and eventually married my father. They had lost touch for decades, then reconnected late in life through a community group for older women in the New England region. Eileen had been at my mother's funeral in 2015, sitting at the back. I hadn't known her. There were many faces I didn't know that day, but that wasn't what made Karen's expression shift when I told her my name. She got up from the table and went to a box on the kitchen bench, the kind of archival box that solicitors use. She lifted out a folder and placed it in front of me. "Your mother left something with my mother," she said. "About 3 years before she died. She made Mum promise not to do anything with it until the right moment. Mum's always said she'd know the right moment when it came. She said if a man named Gerald Whitmore ever turned up at her door, that was it." Inside the folder was a letter in my mother's handwriting. Beneath it were legal documents. I didn't immediately understand references to a property trust, a solicitor's firm in Armadale, and a name I didn't recognize. "Douglas Calloway. I know that name," I said. "That was my mother's brother. He died before I was born." Karen shook her head slowly. "He didn't die before you were born," she said. "He emigrated to Western Australia in 1961, and your grandfather told everyone he was dead because of an argument over the family property. Douglas never contacted anyone in the family again, except your mother. They wrote to each other for 50 years. I sat with that for a moment. The kitchen smelled like the pasta on the bench and something baking. Outside, a sprinkler was running on a lawn. "Read the letter," Karen said gently. My mother's handwriting was always precise. The kind that came from an era when penmanship was taught with a ruler. She wrote, "Gerald, if you're reading this, something has happened that I hoped would happen while I was still alive, but always suspected might not. Your great-uncle Douglas is not a myth. He is a real man, and he has been part of your life without you knowing it, in the only way that was available to him. He is the reason you were able to buy that vineyard in 1994. I told him about you. He wanted to help. He sent the money through a personal loan that was structured as a bank instrument, so you would never question where it came from. He said he had no children of his own, and no reason to keep building what he'd built if there was no one to pass it to. But your grandfather's bitterness went deep, and Douglas was afraid of what a direct connection might do to our family while your father was still alive. He is in Esperance, on the south coast of Western Australia. He is very old now, and his health is not good. I am asking you to find him before it's too late. He deserves to know that the vineyard became something real, and you deserve to know where your stubbornness and your love of land comes from. It didn't come from the Whitmores, my love. It came from the Calloways, and there is one Calloway left." I had to put the letter down. I sat in Karen Hollis's kitchen for another hour. She made more tea. She told me what Eileen had shared over the years, that Douglas Calloway had gone to Western Australia as a 23-year-old with almost nothing, worked in the pastoral industry across the Kimberley and the goldfields, and eventually settled in the Great Southern region near Esperance, where he had purchased a large sheep and grain property in the early 1970s. He had never married. He had, according to what Eileen understood, built something substantial, though neither of them knew the precise details. The solicitor's firm listed in the folder was Calloway Registered, based in Esperance. That night in my room above the hardware store, I didn't sleep. I lay on the narrow bed and looked at the ceiling and thought about the $47,000 that had arrived in our bank account in March of 1994, described in the documentation as a private loan from a regional investment vehicle. My father had looked into it briefly and satisfied himself it was legitimate before advising us to accept it. I had always assumed it was some kind of agricultural grant or a program I didn't fully understand. I had paid it back over 7 years with interest, and the account it was paid to had eventually closed without explanation. My mother had watched me sign the papers on that vineyard and said, almost to herself, "Someone who loved this family very much made this possible." I'd assumed she meant my father's years of work. I'd assumed wrong. I called the Esperance solicitor the next morning. Her name was Janet Price, and she had clearly been expecting a call like this for some time, though not from me specifically. I explained who I was and read her my mother's letter. There was a pause on the line. Then she said, "Mr. Whitmore, I have been managing Mr. Calloway's affairs for 16 years. He passed away 14 months ago. I am very sorry to tell you that." The ceiling of my ute seemed to lower slightly, but she continued. "He left very specific instructions," she said. "He was aware of you. He followed your life more closely than you would imagine. He knew about the vineyard, about the business you built, and about what happened with your marriage. He had my firm monitoring the public records." She paused again. "He was devastated when he learned you'd lost the property. His instruction was that if you were ever located, and he believed you would be, his estate was to be transferred to you as sole beneficiary." She told me the estate consisted of 4,200 acres of productive farmland outside Esperance, currently leased to a neighboring farming operation. A modest but well-maintained homestead on the property. A managed investment portfolio built over 40 years. Liquid assets in 2 accounts. Total estimated value, $6.4 million. I was 63 years old, sitting in a Holden ute outside a hardware store in Muswell Brook, and the universe had just handed me something I didn't know existed. The drive to Esperance takes the better part of 2 days from the Hunter Valley. I made it in 3, stopping overnight in Adelaide, taking my time through the Nullarbor, because I needed the space of that flat, empty country to think. There is something about the Nullarbor that forces honesty. There's nowhere for the mind to hide. You're just the road and the scrub and the sky. And whatever you're carrying, what I carried was complicated. Grief for a great uncle I'd never met, but apparently shared a language with the language of land, of stubbornness, of investing in things that would outlast you. Grief for my mother, who had known all of this and chosen silence out of love, or out of fear, or out of the impossible calculus that parents make when they are trying to protect their children from information that might hurt as much as it helps. Anger that the vineyard was gone. Not at my mother, not at Douglas, but at the particular cruelty of timing that meant the inheritance arrived after the loss instead of before it. And something else. Something that I couldn't immediately name but that felt, tentatively, like possibility. The Calloway property was called Mallee Ridge. I drove through the gate on a Thursday afternoon in April when the light was low and gold across the paddocks and the sheep were moving slowly toward water. The homestead was limestone and timber, single story, with a wide veranda on 3 sides and a garden that had been left to go slightly wild. It smelled like warm dust and dry grass and something faintly floral that I later identified as old rose bushes along the western wall. Janet Price met me at the homestead. She was a compact, serious woman in her 60s who shook my hand with the grip of someone who has spent decades managing other people's complicated affairs. She gave me a proper tour, the house, the outbuildings, the paddocks, the bore water system. She explained the lease arrangement, the investment accounts, the procedural steps that remained before formal transfer of title. Then she handed me a second letter. This one in a different hand, shakier, the handwriting of a very old man. He had written, "Gerald, I know your name because your mother gave it to me on the phone in the spring of 1993, when she called to tell me she had a son who was going to do something real with his life. She said you had the Callaway stubbornness and the Callaway love of ground under your feet, and she was right, wasn't she? I followed what you built. I had someone send me the wine critic's review from 2003. I kept it. It's in the top drawer of the desk in the study. I want you to know that what you lost was not your fault. What your wife and her brother did was a calculated thing, and the law is not always wise about these matters. I am sorry I didn't find a way to warn you. I watched, and I told myself it would resolve itself. And then it didn't. And by then, I was too ill to intervene the way I wanted to. What I can give you now is ground. Use it the same way you use the other ground all of yourself, without reservation. That is the Callaway way. We are not people who hold back. Your mother never held back either, even when she probably should have. I hope she knew I loved her. I hope you know that building something for you was the whole point of all of it. Your great-uncle, Douglas. The 2003 wine review was in the drawer, exactly where he said it would be. It was yellowed at the edges, and he'd made a small pencil mark beside the paragraph that mentioned the winemaker's name. I sat in Douglas Callaway's chair in Douglas Callaway's study for a long time. The formal title transfer took 4 months to complete. Janet Price was efficient and thorough, and the lease arrangements meant the property was already generating income that covered its running costs. I was not inheriting a problem. I was inheriting something that had been tended carefully and was ready to be used. I did not rush. At 63, I had learned at some cost the difference between urgency and impatience. I spent the first 2 months simply learning the property, walking it in the mornings with the kind of attention I used to give my vines, understanding the water, the soil types, the condition of the fencing, the history of the paddocks, the neighboring farmer who held the lease. A third-generation grain grower named Phil Tennant was straightforward and fair. He'd respected Douglas, and he extended that respect to me when it became clear I intended to be present, not absent. I moved into the homestead in July. In August, I drove back to the Hunter Valley to collect what little I'd kept in storage tools, some furniture, several boxes of books and photographs, and 1 case of the 2003 Shiraz that Marcus had kept in his garage without quite knowing why. Marcus met me at his house in Cessnock on a Saturday morning. He'd heard through Ellie what had happened. He was awkward in the way of a man who knows he behaved poorly and hasn't yet worked out what to do about it. We sat on his back deck for 2 hours and drank coffee, and I let him talk. I didn't make it easy for him, but I didn't make it hard either. He was my son. Whatever had passed between us was going to take time. Some things do. Ellie flew to Esperance in September with her partner, a quiet Irishman named Declan who clearly loved her well. She walked the property with me on a Sunday and asked intelligent questions and told me she was glad I'd found it. She cried once, briefly, when she read her grandmother's letter. Then she straightened up and said she wanted to bring the grandchildren to visit as soon as there were grandchildren to bring. I told her she had about as long as it took me to plant a new vineyard on the Mallee Ridge property's northern slope, where the soil drainage was promising and the afternoon light was right. She said that seemed like a reasonable timeline. What happened with Craig and Diane? People ask me sometimes. The honest answer is that I don't spend much time thinking about it. The managed investment portfolio Douglas left me included, among other things, the proceeds from 40 years of careful reinvestment. When Janet Price's firm reviewed the original divorce settlement against my current financial position, they identified several procedural anomalies in the property valuation methodology. Anomalies consistent with a valuation that had been steered toward a particular outcome. A firm in Sydney that specializes in post-settlement reviews took the matter on. I am not a vindictive man. I made a decision early in this process that I would not let what Diane and Craig had done define what I did next. But I am also not a man who believes that injustice should be left unaddressed simply because addressing it is uncomfortable. The review is ongoing. I'll let the legal process do what legal processes do. What I can tell you is that Biscuit is in my kitchen in Esperance right now, sleeping on a bed. I bought him specifically because he's 11 years old and his joints need the extra cushioning. Ellie drove him down from the Hunter Valley in October. He was at Diane's new apartment in Newcastle, and she'd been looking for someone to take him because the building had a no-pets policy she hadn't accounted for. He took about 3 minutes to rediscover that I was his person. Dogs are good at that. Better than people, sometimes. The North Slope Vineyard is planted. I put in Shiraz and a small block of Chardonnay, which I wouldn't have attempted in the Hunter Valley climate, but Esperance's maritime cool suits it well. Phil Tennant told me I was mad to try winemaking this far south. I told him that was the kindest thing anyone had said to me in years. He laughed in the way that means you've made a friend. There is a young woman named Siobhan who manages the administrative side of the property and has more talent for agricultural logistics than I had at 40. I pay her properly and tell her so when she does something well, because my great-uncle taught me posthumously that the measure of what you build is whether it can continue without you needing to be the most important person in the room. I think about Douglas Calloway most mornings when I'm walking the paddocks before breakfast. I think about the shape of a life built in deliberate silence for someone else's benefit, about what it costs to love something or someone from a distance, without acknowledgement, without the ordinary satisfactions of being known, about my mother who carried that secret for 5 decades and found, in the end, a way to pass it forward without breaking the promises she'd made along the way. I think about what the solicitor in Cessnock said to me, that the system wasn't built for people who loved what they'd made. He was right about the system. He was wrong about what matters. The system can take a property. It cannot take the knowledge of how to read a piece of land. It cannot take the stubbornness that gets you through the 4th year of a drought or the 1st year of starting over. It cannot take the things that were given to you, not through documents and title transfers, but through blood and patience and the faith that one generation places in the next. I still do contract fencing work occasionally. Not because I need the income, but because there are small landholders in this region who need reliable help, and because I am better at conversation when my hands are occupied. Last month, I did 2 days on a property 30 kilometers east, helping a semi-retired couple from Perth reinstate some boundary fencing after a bushfire came through in summer. On the second afternoon, the husband sat with me during a break and told me he'd moved to the property after losing his business in a partnership dispute. He'd been a civil engineer for 30 years. Now he was learning how to grow olives. I told him that the olive is one of the most patient trees in horticulture, that it will give you almost nothing for the first decade and then reward you with 40 years of production if you've done the basic things correctly. He said that sounded discouraging. I told him it sounded exactly right to me. When I left, I gave him my card and told him to call if he wanted to compare notes. He looked at the card, Mallee Ridge Pastoral, Calloway Whitmore Holdings, and said, with a slight laugh, that he thought I was a fencer. I told him, I was. Now, I'm something else. The only way I got from one to the other was by doing the work in between without knowing what was coming. Here is what I've learned at 63 that I wish someone had told me at 42. The things that ruin you are rarely the things that finish you, provided you don't stop. The law is imperfect, and it favors people who understand how to work it, which is not always the same as people who deserve to win. Never sign anything you haven't read carefully. And never assume a family member acting as a financial advisor is acting in your interest. The land doesn't lie. Other people do, and usually for reasons that are less impressive than they believe. But here is the most important thing, the one that Douglas Calloway understood at 23 and spent his entire life demonstrating in silence. What you build for someone else is never wasted. Even if they never know who built it. Even if the timing is wrong and the system interferes and the life you intended for them looks nothing like the life they end up with. The investment survives. It finds its way. Sometimes it takes 50 years and a canvas shopping bag left in the back of a ute, but it finds its way. My name is Gerald Whitmore, and I am the great-nephew of Douglas Calloway. And I am standing in red dirt a long way from the Hunter Valley, with shiraz vines in the ground and a dog at my feet and enough time left, I think, to make something worthy of what was given to me. Rock bottom is not the end of the story. In my experience, it's the last page of the first chapter. If this story has stayed with you, I'd be glad if you shared it with someone who needs to hear that starting over at 60 is not starting late, it's starting with everything you've learned. And if you've ever felt that the thing you built was taken from you unfairly, know that the ability to build it was never taken. That stays. Hit the like button if you want to see more stories from the people and places that make up this country's quiet, stubborn heart. And subscribe to Home Voices, because there are more stories here that deserve to be told.